let's review together the parable of the weeds among the wheat. And you can look at the pictures and see if you can remember what was all happening. So first of all, Jesus was busy teaching. And do you remember the way he was teaching? In other words, where did he go? And you can kind of see it on the picture there. Where did he go? He often went on a boat so he could be heard. And he got in that boat. And do you remember the format of his teaching? What did he use to teach? It starts with a P. It's a parable. He taught them different things on this world that teach about heaven, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And one of the parables he told was this parable of the wheat and the weeds. And so there was a farmer, and this farmer, what did this farmer have? He had a bunch of seeds, and he planted those seeds in the ground, just like you'd expect. But at night, do you remember what happened? What happened at night? Yeah, there came an enemy. And an enemy took a bunch of weed seeds, just plants that you didn't want to grow, that looked a lot like wheat, that masqueraded as wheat, but really weren't good. So he threw those in the ground, and so they got all mixed up with everything else. And when the seeds got planted, well, not only did the good plants grow, but what also grew? Yeah, all the weeds. So the weeds grew, and well, a worker came, and the worker said, "What happened? How did this happen?" And the farmer said an enemy did this. He knew somebody was against him. Do you remember the idea that the worker had? And he said, "Do you want us to pull the weeds up?" But the farmer said no, because if you did that, what was he afraid would happen? He was afraid that if you pulled them up, the good plants would get wrecked. He'd pull up some of the wheat along with all the weeds. He said, just let them grow together. And then at the end, then he said, collect the weeds and burn them up. Do you remember what he said would happen to the wheat? He said they would be gathered up and they'd be brought where? Into the barn to be with him and his collection forever. Yeah, so that's the story, that's the parable. And what does it mean? You remember? Who is the farmer? Who does the farmer represent? The farmer represents God. Who did the enemy represent? The enemy represents Satan and those who try to take away from his word. And remember the good plants, they were God's children, and the weeds were unbelievers. And so the unbelievers, when they were burned up, that represented hell. And do you remember what the barn represented? Where the good plants, God's people, would go? God would gather them into heaven. All that is only possible, only happens because Jesus Christ paid for the sins of the world. And this parable points how important it is to be in God's family and how hard Satan works to try to wreck things and how we can't, why does God let this world continue? He doesn't just pluck Christians out of it, but he lets this world continue because right now we don't know who all the unbelievers and believers are. He lets them all stay together. He lets this world continue so that all God's children will grow and be ready to come into the barn. And then after Jesus told this parable, do you remember what he did? He taught more parables. He kept on teaching God's people about his kingdom because he wanted them to believe in him and go to heaven. And that's the parable. Thanks for reviewing it with me, the parable of the weeds among the wheat.